Hello, everybody. Welcome to our very first episode of Let's Talk Books at NMU. I am Lynn Domina, professor and head of the English department here at Northern Michigan University, located on the traditional and current homeland of the Anishinaabe people. And today I'm welcoming Larry Nesper, author of the recently published Our Relations, The Mixed Bloods, Indigenous Transformation and Dispossession in the Western Great Lakes. We will continue this series monthly on the third Friday of the month at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. Next month, our presenter will be Gail Okawa, and she'll be talking about her book, Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. You will notice at the bottom of your screen, the icons for the chat and for the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk with one another. If you want to ask a question for Dr. Nesper at the end of his presentation, use the Q&A. I will be monitoring that, and I will pass along those questions to him. If you see a question that interests you, you can give it a thumbs up icon, and that will let me know it's a popular question. This episode is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. If you'd like the link to the recording when it's available, you can just email me at english@nmu.edu, and I will forward you that link. Before we get started, I want to give a big thanks to Matt Herbig from Audiovisual Services here at NMU, who is helping with the technical end of this series, and to Dr. Rob Wynn, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who is supporting us financially. Now I'd like to introduce Larry Nesper. He's very recently retired as professor of anthropology and the director of American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Author of The Walleye War, The Struggle for Ojibwe Spearfishing and Treaty Rights, an account of the conflict that took place 30 years ago in northern Wisconsin. He is also author of the book he will talk about today, Our Relations, The Mixed Bloods, Indigenous Transformation and Dispossession in the Western Great Lakes, which was published almost a year ago by SUNY Press. Interested in American Indian nation building generally, he has also done ethnographic research exploring the development of tribal courts in Wisconsin, as well as state court-tribal court relations. He has worked as a consultant for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Bad River, and several of the tribes in the state. He has taught courses on American Indian culture and history, anthropology of law, and the anthropology of religion. So, Dr. Nesper, welcome. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Len. It's good to be here and with you virtually on this inaugural event. It's an honor and humbling for me to be the inaugural speaker on this event. As you say, I've been invited to talk about my new book about Ojibwe mixed bloods. So I'll start then with a summary of what that book is about. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the book project, where it came from, and then go on to some of the conclusions for its larger implications, and then open this up, as you say, for questioning as we go. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen. And there it is. So you can look at my screen and kind of push myself a little bit in the background there. All right. So this book is about racial ideology. It's about settler colonialism and the transformation of an indigenous polity and a sociocultural landscape as the outcomes of the treaty process and subsequent federal Indian policy. It details the ways in which the term half-breeds and mixed bloods emerged in the context of the fur trade and the treaty economies of the Great Lakes region over the course of the 19th century, then effervesced as social distinctions with the establishment and allotment of Indian reservations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then finally receded in the 20th century. So we don't hear those terms so much anymore. The emergence of these social distinctions was the outcome of competing conceptions of belonging and difference that interacted in the fur trade and the treaty economy periods and transformed the indigenous polity as a result. I attempt to capture those conceptions in the title, Our Relations, Mixed Bloods, as our relations is the term repeatedly used by Native people to refer to what were called the mixed bloods belonging to the Chippewa of Lake Superior, which is an exact phrase from the Treaty of 1854. These distinctions made the transformation of the landscape of the Western Great Lakes region possible because the so-called mixed bloods were distinguished as a class and then recruited to influence the internal tribal politics and facilitate the treaty process. What had been a commons organized by kinship and customary law was appropriated and enclosed by settlers for purposes of settlement and resource extraction. Tactical use of the social distinction between Indians and mixed bloods played a critical role in the very material process of dispossession, specifically enabling the capitalization of the first mining companies in northern Wisconsin and then lumbering companies in Minnesota, thus initiating a complete reimagining and subsequent transformation of the landscape and the peoples who lived upon it. This case study aspires to link ethnic formation and transformation to the forces of settler colonialism and the subsequent changes of the Western Great Lakes landscape. It also aspires to reveal a hitherto largely unrecognized capacity and agency on the part of indigenous polities to assimilate sources of power in the form of persons and things, and in doing so, simultaneously reproduce and transform themselves. This study is motivated in relatively current historical events, however. So most of the book is about, a lot of the book is about the mid-19th century and then brings it up into the late 19th and into the early 20th century. But the whole thing is motivated in a relatively recent historical events that threatened another major environmental effect on the tribes. And now I'll narrate a little bit of what happened with that at this point. Several years ago now, Gogebic Taconite, a mining company, suspended its plans to build the largest open pit iron mine in the headwaters of the Bad River in the Pinocchio Hills, just south of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewas reservation in northern Wisconsin. Chairman of the band, Mike Wiggins, honors me by writing a foreword to the book, and he details the potential impact of such a mine on the community at Bad River and the struggle of the community to resist it. Sorry, I'm juggling between the different screens here to try to give you a decent PowerPoint as I go. So this company, Gogebic Taconite, effectively wrote a ferrous mining bill for the state of Wisconsin, and the aggressively pro-industry legislature passed it in 2013 as its first act. The bill exempted ferrous mining from the usual environmental restrictions on big mining operations. It stated boldly that the environmental damage is a necessary outcome of such extractive and lucrative undertakings. The Bad River Band and their allies lobbied and demonstrated actively against the passage as the proposed mine lay in tribe's watershed. I'll show you a few slides here of some of the general geography. This is the macro geography of the region of what is called now Anishinaabe, the sort of the land of the Anishinaabe. This is an enormous multi-tribal, multi-reserve, even ethnic to some extent, socio-political, cultural formation, of which the region that I'm talking about is a small part. When we close up on this a little bit closer, we can see the iron ranges of Lake Superior and how they occur here. I'm mostly interested in the Gogebic range here. And here's another map that shows that same shape of the Gogebic range with all of the various mining companies that established themselves on that strip of land, or that mining formation. So you're going to get used to seeing that scar, that shape in some of these kinds of images. There's another image of it, shows the Bad River Reservation, shows the area south of the Bad River Reservation, the headwaters of the Bad River that runs through the reservations, the location of the mine, an area that was designated that was going to be mined in that. So that was the intent. One of the effects of this proposal was that the Bad River Band, began to draw the sharpest of all possible lines between those who would support the escalation of mining in Wisconsin and those who opposed it. An aspect of that whole thing was to hire me to do ethnographic and ethnohistorical study of the watershed as part of redoing their water quality standards, now that the band were treated as a state by the Environmental Protection Agency. When the same EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers began to indicate that they were not going to be able to work with the state of Wisconsin as closely as they had in the past, the writing began to appear on the wall, as it were. Anti-mining voices proliferated, they grew louder. Iron prices on the world market declined with the slowing of economic growth in China. The financial viability of the proposed project diminished, and the project was ultimately suspended in February of 2015. Well, while doing ethnographic research at Bad River, I was shown a newspaper article from News from Indian Country. Then I was given access to a Google map of the Pinocchis that showed that both Chippewa and Dakota mixed bloods held 80-acre parcels of land there for a short time in the 1850s. And this is a copy of the article that appeared. And there you can, again, now that you're a little bit familiar with the geography, you can see that same that stripe across there of the area where the Iron Range occurs. And you also are told now here in this article that there are Chippewa and Santee Sioux allotments of land there. And I'll show you what these look like when we superimpose and go to the the Bureau of Land Management records on this. These 80-acre parcels basically cover that whole Iron Range. The blue ones are Ojibwe, the red ones are Dakota. And then another close-up of this shows you that when the DNR cooperated with the mining company to restrict access to the land, these mixed blood allotments of land ran right through the center of where the mining was being proposed. So I mean, you looked at this even more carefully. You could look at the individual allotments that were sitting right on top of the Iron Range, and identify them by the person, by the very name of the person who in fact held on to that at a period of time. Well, I mean, what is going on with this really is the question. Oh, how did they get this land? Did they ever live on it? Whether they lived on it or not, did they ever How did they lose it, et cetera? So a bunch of questions began to be raised in a number of people's minds. People were talking about, we need to do walkovers of this land. We need to determine what the nature of the native use was this. Well, what was going on was that there was a provision of the treaty of 1854, as it would turn out, and that's it. Is that showing completely on there? That doesn't look like it's completely on there. It's a little bit cut off for me, but I don't know what to do about that. Anyway, the Treaty of 1854 has it that each head of a family or single person over the age of 21 of the mixed bloods belonging to the Chippewa of Lake Superior shall be entitled to 80 acres of land to be selected by them under the direction of the president. So there's a provision in the Treaty of 1854 that was a great big land cession treaty. It ceded that whole area of the Arrowhead region of Minnesota in exchange for the creation of reservations. And within the section on the reservations that were created that would be collectively held, like Lac-Courte and Bad River and Red Cliff and Lac du Flambeau, there were these individual reservations that were going to be created for mixed bloods. Okay, that was the provision in the treaty. And the heart of the book really deals with the way in which the provision of this treaty was administered, how they came about defining who the mixed bloods were and how they were going to manage this allocation of land. Well, as it's going to turn out, several score of the mixed bloods would have their 80-acre parcels located for them in the Pinocchio Hills, which are fairly iron-rich, but rather rocky lands, maybe good for hunting and preying, even as a sugar bush, but not at all suitable to the goals they apparently shared with Congress. And that was for them to settle on agriculturally viable land. The whole point of the idea of allotting land to mixed bloods was to settle them on agriculturally viable land such that they could be demonstration sort of quasi-citizens for their Ojibwe relatives, be integrated into the new economy, et cetera. So the whole point of this provision was to turn the mixed bloods into social and cultural citizens who would have far more in common with their new white neighbors than they would with their Indian relatives. They said they're going to be models of assimilation for the Indian relations and such. That was the intent of this. They'd be assimilated into the reservation, but as it would turn out, this would not at all happen. When this study that I've now undertaken of trying to figure out what's going on with this provision of the treaty, what's the relationship between the treaty provision and the fact that the lands were located in the Pinocchio Hills, the iron-rich Pinocchio Hills, it was intended as an intervention in the federal permitting process. It was sort of an activist project, as it were. The prospective mine was still being developed. Clear title might arguably be clouded by showing how the Indian office failed in its trust responsibility to the mixed bloods by allowing trust lands to be transferred to private interests, because somehow what had obviously had happened was the land that was intended for mixed bloods was now in the possession of a mining company. So basically, what's the story? How did that happen? Well, here's the story of how it happened. Julius Austrian sought and received power of attorney over scores of mixed bloods. Unknowingly, and probably knowingly in some cases, these mixed bloods acquiesced in empowering these men, Austrian and some of his cronies, to go to the government land office with highly restricted scrip certificates and locate 80-acre parcels of land for them. The lands were located in the Pinocchio Hills, 20 miles or so south of Lake Superior, that had recently been discovered to contain iron ore. Within months, the lands were patented to within a few months of the lands being patented to the mixed bloods, they were actually alienated to non-Indian businessmen who incorporated themselves as the LaPointe Iron Company in 1860. The company still exists, and it was leasing land to Gogebic taconite. So I got interested in the process by which the language of the treaty, how it was interpreted and realized as policy, such that the outcome made this possible. And one of the steps in this whole thing was the agent of the company, of the federal Indian agent, wrote what's called a scrip certificate. So if these mixed bloods have the right to an 80-acre parcel of land, how are they going to redeem that? Well, we're going to give them scrip certificates, and they're going to take these to the land office, and they're going to pick out the land they want, and then they're going to be given a certificate or a patent, actually, that shows that they own it. It's the title. Well, look at this scrip certificate. It is expressly understood and declared that any sale, transfer, etc., or assignment of this, I'm having a little trouble with some of the, there it is. Let's see if we can move this out of the way here. Sorry about this. Expressly understood and declared that any sale, transfer, mortgage, assignment, or pledge of this certificate or any right accruing under it will not be recognized as valid by the United States, and that the patent for these lands located by virtue thereof shall be issued directly to the above named reservee, that's the mixed blood person, and no wise inure to the benefit of any other person or person. So in other words, this certificate for a land, this scrip for land, can't be sold, it can't be transferred, anything like that can happen with it. It's really intended for these individual people. Well, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that they're going to sign pieces of paper that transfer this right to these potential mining corporation heads. Well, the Attorney General of the United States winds up weighing in on this whole thing about whether or not these mixed bloods kind of have the right to even do this, right? To sign away a federally guaranteed right. And the Attorney General of the United States basically says, no, they don't. They're half-bloods. They're Indians. These people are Indians. And so my argument to this whole thing is that if they're Indians, they should be protected by the trust responsibility such that this kind of ripoff should never be able to happen at all. I want to stop here and ask, just because I'm staring into this computer and wondering, what's it like out there on the receiving end? Are there any questions that you have at this point that you want to raise? Am I being clear in this process? Before I go on, I need a little amen out there to the few people that are out there listening to this.
No one has posted a question yet, Larry.
All right. All right.
But we can see your slides, and
you can see it. And it's semi-coherent. It's kind of legalistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. And I'm trying to be efficient about this because it takes a couple hundred pages to tell this story and try to jam.
In the citizenship, the legal status of Indians at this point is very different.
It sure is.
Than most people assume about citizens, people who could become citizens of the United States.
Exactly. Well, let me go on then. I'll carry this a little bit further and go back to my slides here if I can find them. Oh, where is it? There we go. All right. So A few years later, there's going to be a congressional investigation because there was all of this phony script being written and redeemed at land offices, ostensibly signed by mixed bloods, now in the possession of lumber company people in Minnesota. And so there's like thousands of pieces of fraudulent counterfeit script that has now been redeemed for 80-acre parcels of land in Minnesota to get access to the lumber up there. And so we wind up getting a congressional investigation into this whole thing. And this is what the congressional investigation says regarding the very possibility of doing this. It says, we are well satisfied that the mixed blood signing said powers of attorney, which was generally done by touching the pen once, even if they were a dozen papers to sign, as a general thing, never had the slightest conception of the nature of and the consequences of the act. So they didn't know what they were doing, right? Somebody was putting a few, in this case, a few $1,000s in front of them and said, if you make an X on this piece of paper, this money is yours. Well, that's pretty tempting, especially at that time. That's a hell of a lot of money. It was a few $100s at the time, but if we look at what that in 2020 dollars, it's something like $3,000 for signing your name to a piece of paper. That's a pretty easy thing to do, not really understanding what it is that you're doing. A part of the government, the commissioner of the government land office, was wondering about, should the patents that we're going to issue to these people be restricted in some way or another so that this kind of a transfer can't happen? And the answer came back from the Secretary of the Interior. Actually, it gets pretty high. It comes back from the Secretary of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, but the Secretary of Interior, the next level up, says, basically, we don't need to do that. We don't need to restrict these patents in any way. That's all sort of been taken care of, and pretending as if this is going to work out. And in fact, the effect of this is going to be land loss, right? That's what a patent looks like. And I'm going to call your attention, just like so many really important legal things. We get scores and scores of pages of briefs, scores and scores of pages of court decisions, and they all turn on 2 or 3 words, right? The meaning of 2 or 3 words. In this case, this patent for this piece of land to this woman, this mixed blood woman, this line is the one that I've identified as the significant thing. It belongs to her unto the said Esther, and to her heirs and assigns for other. In other words, she can say, she can sell this thing, right? That's what this means, right? That one word, if the word assigns wasn't in there, but only heirs was in there, it would be a matter of descent. It would be a matter of this can only go to a child, right? A legal child of hers of some kind. Or there could be, alternatively, that phrase could not be there at all. This belongs to said Esther, period. And we might have even seen language in there, and this cannot go to anybody else for any purpose, can't be transferred, etc. Like it said in the script certificate itself, right? But that wasn't done. So what's the effect of that? These men, these traders in the area of La Pointe, wind up going to 60, 70 of these mixed bloods people, get them to sign pieces of paper, and then they incorporate themselves as the La Pointe Iron Company. That's their, that's the goal. And they're going to now start prospecting for iron ore in the Pinocchio Hills, which they now have legal title to, having acquired these mixed blood 80-acre parcels of land. I looked up all of these pieces of land. These are the usual land descriptions, the south half of the northeast quarter of section 25, township 40, range 1, 80 acres, right? You can look these up on the Bureau of Land Management website. And turns out that every one of these was once in possession of a mixed blood, and we even know who they were, right? So we can look at the particular piece of land that this was once a piece of land owned by this particular individual. Yeah, that just gives you a detail of what that looks like. So thousands of acres of land that belonged to mixed bloods were lost in this transfer. The effort on the part of the federal government was to distinguish the mixed bloods from the other Indians on the reservation. However, Indian people did not think in racial terms about who these mixed bloods were. The mixed bloods belonged to the Chippewa, right? That's how they were described in the treaty. The Chippewas, the Chippewa people who the whites regarded as Chippewa Indians, regarded the mixed bloods as their relatives. And that was the currency of membership and of inclusion and of belonging at the time, right? They were part of us. So the transformation, or one of the transformations that is happening, is that the native polities are generating a new kind of indigenous person, and that is the mixed blood, who has cultural capital from both the dominant society as well as the indigenous society, who can work as a mediator in some cases, who brings skills to the tribal entity that the tribal entity might not have otherwise in that. And that's a big part of what the book is about, is this competing ideas about inclusion and membership. What's happening in the United States, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, is that race is becoming the way to figure belonging and difference. Either you are something or you're not something. 1/16 black blood makes you black. 1/8 Indian blood makes you Indian, etc. All of that stuff is becoming really salient at this time. Indian people are not thinking in terms of this, but they will be, in a sense, forced to think in terms of this. And this mixed blood becomes a kind of political designation within the tribal polities in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And it gets cashed out in terms of whether they're progressive or whether they're traditional. They start using the idiom of blood to describe that. And I go into that stuff in this book at different points about the struggle within the tribal councils between the so-called mixed bloods and the so-called full bloods over the issue of allotment, who should be included on these reservations and such. So I go into that as well. I'm going to read just the last bit of the book in the conclusion, just a page or so, to give you a sort of reflection on the bigger issues that are entailed in this kind of thing. So I'll just do this right now, and we'll bring my comments to a conclusion here. This has been the story of the emergence and disappearance of a social category and the transformation of a human and physical landscape. The category mixed blood, alternatively and more disparagingly and therefore tellingly, half-breed, right? That was also another term, emerged in the southeast of the United States when the so-called civilized tribes contested colonial domination by trading off elements of culture in an effort to preserve and enhance society and polity. At the same time, a racialist ideology of figuring belonging and difference was on the ascent. The effort to resist this domination on the parts of those tribes was often led by people who had indigenous mothers and settler fathers. Thus, they were in possession of cultural and social capital from both aspiring dominators and those who were eventually dominated. Mixed bloods, therefore, were a settler invention born of that ascendant racial ideology. The term's use sought to inhibit and delegitimize the transformation of indigenous polities, right? Because we were saying in some cases, these mixed bloods aren't really Indians, so they can be treated differently. In the Western Great Lakes region, racial ideology diffused to the tribes by the middle of the 19th century, even as band-level societies had diversified over the course of 2 centuries to include different classes of people, with the tendrils of indigenous society penetrating the settlers. The category of mixed blood was largely imposed upon indigenous polities in the treaty process, even as those indigenous polities themselves were being constituted and transformed in the treaty relationship. Over time, this category would serve to disrupt those internal divisions, making coherent, unified resistance to domination difficult to achieve. As more and more Euro-Americans settled in the region, their totalizing, binary, and asymmetrical racial model of unmarked whites and marked non-whites diffused to and was appropriated by the indigenous communities. This had the effect of diminishing the difference between non-white people with homogeneous and heterogeneous genealogies, so that by the middle of the 20th century, there were only Indians or tribal members, and they were physically or genealogically tied to the lands specifically reserved for them. Indigenous society before the treaty economy was multi-centric and had no fixed geographical boundaries, being organized by kinship. Once the region was ceded, private ownership, then mining and lumbering worked as an enclosure movement, constituting identities and society in spatial terms. Indigenous society would now have geographical boundaries, even if it preserved its multi-centric character with the reservations. So it's this long process of different kinds of forces, mostly race, mostly extractive industry, mostly this attempt on the part of indigenous societies to respond to the challenges that were presented to them, so that we had the emergence of this category of mixed blood during the fur trade, the use of it during the treaty period, and the eventual disappearance with what the triumph really of racial ideology in this region disallowed the possibility for an intermediate kind of category of person to exist. And they were assimilated mostly to the reservation communities. So that to this day, as many of you probably know, many Native people are 100% Native, of course, but bear these French names from their 7 generations back of their mixed blood grandmothers and grandfathers that were part of this. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and perhaps there are some questions out there that I can address if you have them, and we'll have.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Larry. This is really interesting and informative for me. If anybody listening has questions, you can put them in the Q&A. But meanwhile, I have a couple. One of the things I really liked about this book is how really interdisciplinary it is, and how accessible, as academic writing goes. I thought it was incredibly accessible. Right?
Oh, am I glad to hear that.
Yeah. So I was wondering, given all that you have relied on for source material, if someone is new to this knowledge, especially I think for me, what was really new was a lot about the mining industry. Are there other places someone might start, other things you would recommend people read?
On mining specifically, or on
the whole history of
sure. I think that if you're interested in the 19th century, I think Rebecca Kugel's work is fabulous on her stuff. Lucy Murphy's work is really good on mixed bloods, Creoles in the area of Prairie du Chien, for example. What else do I know of that might be good? I mean, I list a number of the authors in the front. Jackie Peterson's stuff is good on that. I list a number of those early on in this. This is an attempt to kind of synthesize a lot of that knowledge and to really apply it to a very particular situation. I laugh when I think about this book. It's like only an anthropologist would take on the project of writing a whole book about one sentence in one treaty, right? It's like historians have better sense than that, than to do stuff like that. But anthros can occasionally get taken by a particular moment and say, my goodness, this moment speaks to enormous, social and political processes. And that was sort of the seduction here, of doing that. So those would be the ones, those would be the authors, I think, that I would recommend for looking at that, of this kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but given that I am physically located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where iron mining is a substantial industry, do you happen to know whether similar events occurred here, or was it an entirely different historical context?
I don't know if the people, if they got access to the land up there, that this was a method of putting together mining companies. I don't know
Okay.
that. I just don't know it.
Okay.
This was discovered by I thank Amarin Mello in this, and Amarin did a lot of the early work on this, sort of discovering different dimensions of this. And I'm the one who sort of brought it all together in this larger narrative, set it into a larger context. But that might be, I don't know what he knows about this either, I must say.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I just have one other question, and that's about what you call the problem of belonging, which seems to me to be a chronic American problem, and probably in other countries also, but we are so unusual in the different kinds of waves of incorporation of types of people designated racially and otherwise compared to many other countries, and often influenced by our legal structures, but also as much influenced by our imaginations about who belongs and who doesn't.
Really.
So do you have any thoughts on how our legal system or other systems can reimagine belonging? Or should we just not assume the legal structures are capable of reimagining that and approach it from a different angle?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that comes through. That this I don't know how many times I use the phrase belonging and difference, but I use it a lot, and I want to really foreground the idea through this book of these competing notions of belonging and difference had real consequences for both societies and for the relationship between them. And for a while, it looked like, I'm honored and flattered that you've been able to read it and thought what you did of it in terms of its accessibility, but you might remember that section when I'm dealing with the 20th century about the debates within the tribal council about who these mixed bloods were. I mean, in a sense, Ojibwe society had completely accepted the idea of race for a period of time, or so it seemed, right? Or maybe not completely, but also accepted the idea of race as a way to figure belonging and difference. And we see, so not only competition between these modes of figuring belonging and difference between societies, but now within a society, it's being worked out about who's really an Indian and stuff like that, which was probably not a problem 50, 60, 70, 80 years before, that the nature of people's social commitments to each other was what determined their fact of inclusion, right? You were in these relationships of reciprocity with people. You did things for them, they did things for you. You got wealth and resources come your way. You were willing to share them. You were part of it, right? That's what constituted the belonging. The fact that your skin was black, in the case of the Bongas, for example, was not a difference that made a difference, right? The difference that made a difference was whether or not you were generous, whether or not you honored kin, whether or not you visited, whether or not how you spent your time, all of that. And in a sense, that's Anishinaabe law. I would say that so by saying, well, we should push aside or not count on the legal system. Well, the Anishinaabe legal system was saying that you're related by virtue of your behavior, and you're included by virtue of the marriages, that were done in the fashion of the country, as it were, and the kinds of commitments that you had to your relatives. That's law too, right? It isn't just, the law of racial inclusion or exclusion and that. But, I think that American society, I think if anything, it's showing itself, especially recently, the last several years, showing itself how deeply committed it is to a racial ideology. Is that this is a difference that makes a difference. And if healthcare is going to be extended to everybody, despite color, then we don't want it for anybody, right? I mean, you get that sort of post civil rights attitude on the part of people. It reminded me of a Russian proverb about a genie appearing to someone, and the genie says, "I'll give you a wish." And the peasant says, my neighbor has a horse. And the genie says, so you want a horse too? He says, no, kill my neighbor's horse. It's like, I will suffer as long as I know that this person who is other than me is suffering more, right? And I see that the way in which race works in our own society is that, no, I don't want cheap education for my children as long as I can keep it away from people of color. If they're going to be the beneficiaries of this as well, I don't want it for me either, right? It seems to be the kind of attitude that we have. So, I mean, I Native society has really endured, I think, because of its ability to resist this racialization. And I think that it has. I mean, I know people I know a woman, a scholar who's a descendant of the Bongas, right? Of an Afro-Ojibwe family in the early 19th century. And here we are well into the 21st, and these people are included in that. So they have been able to resist that through kinship as being the dominant mode of inclusion. And it's back to that distinction between Ndinaway Magan, my relatives, and these people who are not relatives. So that's sort of a long, winding answer but we're trying to cop out of making suggestions about policy for the United States. I don't. Yeah. That seems to be a pretty grand undertaking.
Yeah. We want to have hope, and we have evidence for that, and we have all kinds of evidence to discourage us.
Both ways. I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I really thank you. This was really interesting. I will be posting this on YouTube, as I said, probably early next week. And in another month, on February the 18th, we will have another speaker, Gail Okawa, talking about remembering our grandfathers' exiles, U.S. imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. So thank you.
Yes, it's been my pleasure. It's been really nice to meet you. And again, thanks again for spending the time with the book and inviting me to come talk.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Good afternoon and goodbye, everybody.
Good afternoon.